Hi everyone, welcome back. We're in Unit 2 now. This is Subunit 1. We're in the pre-war, World War II, and post-war eras. As we go forward, you will hopefully alternately be very impressed with ideas that come from the United States, things we stand for and advocate, and sometimes you'll be horrified at the way we implement some of our foreign policy goals. Now, a lot of people in the United States, even folks who take a class like this, fall firmly on one side or the other as to whether we are a good influence in international affairs or a bad one. I personally see a lot of nuance that there can be aims and goals and things that we try to accomplish that are a net positive on the world, and some that you would be like, what are we thinking? Like, why do we do that? I'm embarrassed by that or ashamed. I hope that you have some nuance to how you interpret things, but I allow you the right to interpret it as you see fit, as long as you can articulate all of the parts of what we're looking at. As far as how much we're going to be covering, right? I mean, we just did 40 years in the first 5 weeks of the class. For the next 5 weeks of the class, we're going to have roughly 45 years. It's a jaw-dropping speed, and one of the reasons is that from the time this class was written, articulated as a course with a course description in the University of Idaho catalog, it's been the same course description. It's Diplomacy Through War and Peace, 1898 to the present. And the present, if you wrote this out during the Reagan administration, there's a lot more present to cover. Or to the present. I've gone all the way back to the 1999 UI catalog. It's the same course description. I imagine if I went to the library and looked at old catalogs, it goes back and back. And so what it means is that there are things that happen that are relevant and germane that earlier courses would have emphasized, and we barely touch on or cover. And I'm going to introduce you to one very briefly, to one of those now. So something that's a theme that we're going to encounter a lot this semester from here forward is the United States' relationship with the Soviets and or the Russians. And there is an important part that would have belonged perhaps in the first section of the course, and this one right here is not even in this section. You're going to pick up U.S.-Soviet relations as a fact of World War II, and then a fact of life going forward in the Cold War. But in fact, the United States is concerned about the Bolshevik Revolution, the Russian Revolution of the late 19-teens. We land troops actually in the far east of the Soviet Union than Russia. Don't have a lot to do with engagements there, but we are interested and engaged. But the Bolsheviks, the Russian Revolution, the rise of the USSR is of great concern to the United States and U.S. diplomats. In fact, we don't extend diplomatic recognition to the USSR until 1933, when it's sort of a long-established fact. Now, someone like Bora would have said long since that if that's the government they choose to have, we should choose to treat with it, but not everyone felt the same way. And certainly when you have a foreign policy dictum like the one that Woodrow Wilson said, where we must make the world safe for democracy, that the existence of a communist regime in the Soviet Union is of concern to our diplomats. So keep this in the back of your mind. It exists through the teens, late teens, 20s, and 30s, but we won't pick it up really until the 40s with World War II. So again, this is just a taste, and then on we go. What you're really going to start this unit with is something called the Good Neighbor Policy, which emerges in the 1930s. So through the 1920s, there's a growing repudiation of the Roosevelt Corollary that we looked at in Unit 1. There's a lot of people either advocating that we should have a softer hand, or that the Roosevelt Corollary had nothing to do with the Monroe Doctrine, that if we really wanted to invade, you didn't need to, or take over a customs house, it shouldn't be based on the Monroe Doctrine, but it should be of its own merits. But essentially, there's sort of in the air with policymakers the desire to have something different. And when Franklin Delano Roosevelt becomes president in 1933, he issues what's now become known as the Good Neighbor Policy. Why is it known that? Because he said our relations with the other nations of our hemisphere should be characterized by those actions of a good neighbor. There you go. That's a clever way to put it. So that would essentially mean that we extend friendship and cooperation, investment, partnerships. We use cultural diplomacy. The rise of Hollywood in the 1930s is a real interesting theme that is another one of those themes we don't have a lot of time to look at. But we begin to use cultural diplomacy both consciously and subconsciously or unconsciously to accomplish our aims. But it's definitely different. And the question then is, when push comes to shove, would we follow up on the Good Neighbor Policy? And this happens in 1938. You got a reading about this. Boy, there's a lot. You could have a whole semester on the U.S. and Mexico. It would be really interesting to look at our relationship over time, particularly because you might have time to look at Mexico and the United States, like from their perspective, not just ours, which we're doing here. But for example, in the late 20s, there was a really interesting period of upheaval in Mexico that's based on the outlawry of the Catholic Church and its rights to do things in Mexico. Long story, interesting story, but it leads to a rebellion called the Cristero Rebellion. Lots of U.S. Catholics are interested in what's going on, and lots of calls to intervene, which don't come to fruition. So that's point one to us for not getting engaged in something that we maybe would have before. And the second comes in 1938 when Lázaro Cárdenas, this fellow here, widely known as Tata Cárdenas, or this affectionate view from the Mexican people as he's delivering on the promises of the Mexican Revolution, they nationalize oil. And instead of sending in troops, which we would have done sooner under dollar diplomacy, and we will do later in other places in the world, we don't. We basically take the position that as long as the Mexicans provide fair compensation to the U.S. and other oil companies whose oil they expropriate, that we'll let them do it. We don't send troops in. And so we could indeed be a good neighbor. So that's one part that you should keep in mind for a change in U.S. policies. A second very important statement comes through the Four Freedoms speech. This is a photo of Four Freedoms Park on Roosevelt Island, which is in New York City. So you see here the tip of Roosevelt Island with the UN in the background there. This is a place I enjoy taking UI students when we go visit New York and the UN because this statement from FDR as president about the four freedoms he expects of speech, of worship, from what? From fear, establishes our ideology and our perspective leading into World War II. There were a lot of people in the United States who had questions about who we should favor in World War II. That was the time sort of when before the horrors of the Nazi regime were clear to everyone. There were people who knew what was going on very early in that process, but otherwise the question was territorial acquisition, which we know was outlawed in the Kellogg-Briand Pact. But at the time, France and England and Portugal and others had colonies, so it wasn't like you were choosing one over the other. But anyway, when he lays this out, the four freedoms, you'll get to hear him speak in the unit. It changes our direction, and it's certainly clear that we will be favoring the Allied cause, because freedom of speech, of worship, from what? From fear. Totalitarians, dictators cannot provide that. So it's sort of a continuation of the Wilsonian ideal. And if you take that Wilson idea plus this idea from Roosevelt, the four freedoms, it really underpins much of the rest of what we do for the 20th into the 21st centuries. So we have the next theme you'll pick up is the major themes, the major questions in World War II. So you'll see in the unit that I've decided to split wartime diplomacy into two pieces. And so one piece is diplomacy about the war and questions over the war and the handling of the war in interacting with our allies. And the second is questions about what the post-war world will look like. Because one of the very interesting things is, even though in international relations we study the UN, we talk about the San Francisco Conference of 1945, this is at the end of World War II where they're actually negotiating the final parts of the charter. There's at least 3 years of heavy negotiations between the allies about what the things should look like. There's a couple of conferences, right? So that when we look down here at this next slide, there's a couple of conferences that precede the San Francisco Conference. One's called the Bretton Woods Conference. One's called the Dumbarton Oaks Conference. These are very important meetings to discuss what the causes of war were in their minds and the conditions necessary for peace that lead to the San Francisco conference where the UN Charter is signed. But there's others too, right? So there's conferences about the conduct of the war at Yalta, at Potsdam, in Tehran, where the leaders of the United States, the USSR, and the UK get together and talk about what to do. So there's a series of very important questions that have to be answered, and they're tricky ones. Like, yeah, we're interested in eventually opening a second front on mainland Europe. This is a huge question for the Soviets because they're just getting creamed on the Eastern Front as the Nazis don't have any mainland opposition. They have to prepare for war, but not actively fighting a war. So could you please, allies, Soviets would say, could you open a second front in France, in Italy, somewhere else? We were fighting in North Africa, but not in Europe. That was a question. We certainly wanted the Soviet help against Japan, and I'll spoil it for you later. We get 3 days of their help. They declare war on 1 August 1945. The war ends a few days later. The type of the ending for the war. So one of the things you'll see is that there's no Treaty of Versailles that ends the war, because we demand unconditional surrenders. If there's an unconditional surrender, you don't need a peace treaty. The peace treaties, like you'll see the peace treaty with Japan, comes in 1951. The war ended in 1945 with unconditional surrender. And so then you negotiate a peace. Similarly, Germany has a peace that comes later because we decide the type of ending of the war should be. And then there's a very important question in the United States about what should happen to territories, possessions, and colonies of our allies. And so that question is there. So then that gets related back to these other conferences that you'll read about and watch about. Bretton Woods about the financial structures of the world. Dumbarton Oaks about the UN structure. There's others as well. For example, UNESCO, which is the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. Its constitution starts with this phrase, because wars begin in the minds of men. It is in the minds of men where we must begin to build the defenses against war. Okay, so they're saying, what were the causes of war? Like, what are the ideologies here? What's going on? And because if World War I sort of happened accidentally through a whole series of alliances that forced it to get bigger and bigger over time, this was purposeful, right? This is a war of aggression that came from the Germans, that came from the Italians, that came from the Japanese. And so you say, what caused it? And so that ideology is one of them, and they want to plan for it. So there's a lot of those things. So we'll look at the formation of the United Nations. Certainly there's an interesting role for the University of Idaho here. You already know that I have something to do with the Borah Foundation on campus that recognizes William Edgar Borah's contributions from Idaho. Boyd Martin was a political science professor at the University of Idaho who was part of the U.S. delegation to the San Francisco conference, helping draft the UN Charter. He was on Senator Vandenberg's staff. He had been asked by President Truman to go. And that's a fascinating connection from the University of Idaho to the UN Charter negotiations. And you should ask yourself, really, why? Why were people ready to not go with the idea that Borah proposed about the League of Nations and, in fact, instead go with the UN? Well, the fact that there is a UN gives us some interesting additional opportunities for U.S. diplomacy and U.S. leadership that can be seen in a very favorable light to us. And it's going to be exemplified by these two individuals in the late 1940s, the post-war era. Eleanor Roosevelt, who, by the way, was the inaugural Borah Symposium speaker in 1938. She had been the first lady. FDR had died, but she had always been a force in American society during his presidency. She wrote a very popular daily newspaper advice column. For example, she traveled around the country extensively, was very important. And she becomes the driving force behind what becomes known as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So then that is seen as one of the most important contributions to future society that we have made. And it comes from an American delegate to the United Nations. She's the one. Okay, so don't skip over that part. Make sure you know her. Ralph Bunche is a little bit different. Ralph Bunche wins the Nobel Peace Prize for his work on behalf of the United Nations, not the United States, helping negotiate the birth, essentially, of Israel and some protection for the non-Israeli occupied parts of Palestine. So he's out there as a diplomat and becomes a very important global figure. So theoretically, when you're in the Secretariat, that's the part of the UN that runs the day-to-day operations, theoretically, you are no longer have a nationality, quote unquote, but everybody knows this is an American, and a black American at that, which is a very interesting message. He expressed frustration sometimes to go from being this important UN negotiator to Jim Crow. And so when people had pressure on him to come back into the United States apparatus, he was hesitant to do so. But then became a figure in the Civil Rights era. But essentially then the United Nations gives us this alternate way to act. Act diplomatically, that is. It's another role, another place to play. So here we are. We're going to whip through World War II here, and we're spending more time on it than anything else individually, because the way things shape out for the rest of history to this point. The birth of the United Nations is an essential component. It's one that we sort of pass over in a lot of U.S. histories as it happened and then it's over. But as hopefully you see, it gives us that opportunity to engage in the world in very unique, different ways steadily, because the organization itself is steady all the way through the present day. Cheers.